Welcome everyone to our Daniels Faculty Lecture Forest Management Planning Data and Analysis Challenge in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest of Ontario with Rob Keron. My name is Reiner Dinkelman and I'm a current Master of Forest Conservation student at the University of Toronto. It is my pleasure to moderate this lecture along with our host, Daniels Faculty Assistant Professor, Daniela Puric-Mladenovic.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Welcome, Rob. The old information management unit is the one where I used to work, and I welcome always their new and exciting work in terms of GIS. So thank you so much, Rob.
So first, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Please note this is being live streamed and recorded. If you do not wish to be captured, please turn off your video. We ask you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. You may add your questions in the chat for me to relay to Rob, or if you wish to ask your questions directly, please put your name in the chat and a note that you wish to ask your question on camera. I would now like to introduce you to our speaker today. Rob Keron graduated from Lakehead University with an Honors Bachelor of Science in Forestry in 2010. He then completed a Master's of Science in Forestry from Lakehead University in 2013, specializing in operations research and supply chain management in forestry, strategic and tactical planning. Rob has worked with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry since August of 2013, most recently as a Regional Resources Analyst in Peterborough, Ontario. Rob provides data and analytical support to forest management plans being written for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest region of Ontario. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you. I guess I'll share my presentation here. Where did it go? There we go. So I think you can see my presentation now. Thank you for that introduction. I'm Rob Keron. I'm a Regional Resource Analyst with the Ministry of Natural Resources, and I work in Peterborough, Ontario. And my screen is not forwarding. There we go. So there I am there. That's me back on the river on Sunday and me in the office. That's the sign on the right. That's a great sign. Whenever I'm in trouble, I always ask, what would Joe do? And Joe's one of our district foresters, and he's a very wise man. So that's one of the things I always ask myself. So as mentioned, I graduated Lakehead with a Honors Bachelor of Science of Forestry in 2010. I then did a master's degree in forestry, specializing in supply chain management. I started as an intern in Sault Ste. Marie, and I now work out of Peterborough. I'm currently streaming from rural southwestern Ontario with COVID lockdowns, and I'm a registered professional forester since 2014. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start with an introduction to planning, just a little bit of background material on just general planning principles, then get into Ontario Forest Management Planning Framework, how we do forest management planning in Ontario. I'll then talk about how we develop a forest management plan, how we set objectives, and how we finally come to a balanced management scenario. And then obviously I want to give you time for some questions. So introduction to planning, just some definitions. Management planning is the process of assessing an organization's goals and creating realistic, detailed plans of action for meeting those goals. So we set goals and then we set a plan in place for reaching those goals. And a management plan has short and long-term strategies to it. Operations research. In my bio, I mentioned that I am into operations research. So this is a discipline that deals with the application of advanced analytical methods to help make better decisions. It's allocating limited resources in an optimal manner, things like logistics, supply chain management, system theory, any kind of optimization. When you plug into your phone, how do I get from my apartment to the University of Toronto, and it gives you an optimal route? That's operations research that gives you that optimal route. I don't know who said this quote at the bottom. It might have been my master supervisor, but it's always stuck with me. And if you can define a problem mathematically, then you can solve it in an optimal manner. So that's what optimization or operations research is. It's defining problems mathematically and then solving that problem. So introduction to planning, there's different levels of planning. There's strategic, tactical, and operational. Strategic is kind of the highest level. It's long-term, it's very core scale. Then there's tactical planning, which is short to medium term. This is finer detail than strategic planning, but not as detailed as operational planning, which is very short term and very fine levels of detail. So the three levels of planning are linked together. Your strategic plan will direct the lower levels of planning. Your tactical plan should follow your strategic plan. And then the lower levels of planning will inform your higher levels of planning. So operational planning will kind of set in bounds what is possible for your strategic plan, and then your strategic plan will direct your tactical and operational planning. So in forestry, it looks something like this. Your strategic plan is out 100, 150 years, and we don't even look at individual years at this point. We're looking at 10-year age classes. Our forest, we look at things like planned forest units, which are just aggregates of similar forests according to their species composition and a few other criterias. We're interested in levels of activity. We're not even necessarily interested in specific individual forest stands at this time. We're interested in levels of activity, strategic silviculture options. So this is things like, are you doing a shelter wood, a clear cut, or a selection harvest? Yield curves is kind of what it's similar forests with similar amounts of timber on it would be on the same yield curve. We're not necessarily interested in individual stands yields at this point. And strategic management zones. 10-year operational plan in forestry would be your tactical plan. So we do our strategic plan, and then we come up with 10 years of planned operations. That's a tactical plan. We also have an annual work schedule. This is where you're identifying individual stands that you want to harvest. The tactical plan is anywhere from 1 to 10 years, 10 years being the operational plan and 1 year being the annual work schedule. You are interested in individual stands. You're interested in road layouts, silvicultural ground rules. So this is kind of a finer scale of silviculture grouping than a strategic silviculture option, but it's not so detailed as a stand level prescription yet. And area of concern layouts. Operational plan, this is your day-to-day operations, forest operations, prescriptions, tree marking, crew, equipment, and truck scheduling, and block layout. The part that I work with is mostly the strategic planning, and I get a little bit into the tactical planning, and I have almost I don't get into operational planning at all. So that's an introduction to planning, and I got a little bit into forestry there. Now we'll look at Ontario's forest management planning framework. So we'll look at three things. We'll look at policy framework, forest management units, and then the manuals and guides which direct how we do forestry. So in Ontario, the Ministry of Natural Resources is responsible for the long-term health of Crown forests. Forest management planning is enabled through the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, and Ontario's forest laws and policies provide direction on sustainable management and use of Crown forests for present and future generations. We have this little thing that you see on the right-hand side of your screen called the 3 pillars of sustainability. The idea here being that sustainable forests manages for economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. So we do not concentrate too heavily on the economic one at the expense of environmental or social, or vice versa. If you concentrate too much on one leg of sustainability, the whole table falls over. We have to balance all 3 areas. So what is a forest management plan? Forest management planning, forest managers, so this is a sustainable forest license holder. This is an industry partner, provides for healthy forests now and in the future by providing a range of sustainable benefits. So timber, other commercial products, wildlife habitat, and recreational opportunities. Forest management plans must ensure sustainability while finding a balance of social, economic, and environmental values. A forest management plan is prepared by a registered professional forester with consultation from a local citizens committee, Aboriginal communities, stakeholders, and other members of the public. A forest management plan is prepared and approved for a 10-year period, and it determines how much and where harvesting can occur, where roads can be built, and how the forest will be renewed. It involves many opportunities for public consultation and involvement as well. We have this thing, it's called an adaptive management process. So this slide is in our forest management planning manual, and at the top of the little wheel on the right, we develop a forest management plan. We use the best policy, science, and data available, and we then implement that plan. So we write the forest management plan for a 10-year period, and then we implement it through a series of annual work schedules. This is a 1-year tactical plan, which is implemented, and then we monitor how that tactical plan has worked through annual reports, independent forest audits, and compliance inspections. There's also on the left-hand side, report and evaluate. We assess how the forest management plan was implemented through the existing annual reports, as well as a year 5 and year 10 enhanced annual report, which has additional requirements on reporting on management, how we've achieved our management objectives. And then when we develop we go back to the top, and when we develop our new forest management plan, we do take the input from how well the previous plan was implemented for improving the next forest management plan. So this is kind of an important concept, the adaptive management circle, and we do implement it quite readily on forest management plans. So forest management units. The Crown Forest Sustainability Act states that a forest management plan is prepared for every forest management unit. So here is the series of forest management units that we have in Ontario. They're color coded for the year that the plan that's currently under development or was just developed, what year that plan starts. This is mostly correct. Algonquin Park in the bottom right, 451, it's now a 2021 plan, and there might be a couple others that aren't quite right there, but those are our forest management units. Each one, as far as the Ministry of Natural Resources, is kind of directed out of one of the 3 regions. So the Northwest region is out of Thunder Bay. So the ones up in the upper left are all handled out of Thunder Bay. Northeast region is out of Timmins, and then I work for Southern region out of Peterborough. So we really only have the 5 units. We got French Severn, the 360, Algonquin Park 451, Bancroft Minden 220, Ottawa Valley 780, and then Mazenod Lanark 140. So we have our 5 units in Southern region. I've been heavily involved with the Northeast region, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence plans there. So Nipissing 754, that was a 2019 plan. I was the analyst assigned to that, as well as Sudbury Forest 889. I've been involved in one degree or another with all the other Great Lakes St. Lawrence plans. So from 615 across to 140, some more heavily involved than others, mostly the Northeast plans, but a little bit are Southern region ones. So those are our forest management units. Not all forest management units are created equal. So this is a little, I wasn't going to put this slide in originally, but it actually fit well here. So you can see the size, the amount of harvest from each forest management unit is quite different. Like Southern region and Great Lakes St. Lawrence in general is a lot smaller than the boreal units for the amount of volume that comes off. There's a few reasons for that. One of which is our partial harvesting system. So boreal is pretty much only clear-cut forestry. I think there's one of the Northwest units might be talking about doing a shelterwood and a white pine stand in one of their plans, but I don't know that they've done a lot of shelterwood up there. We do have the 3 silviculture systems we apply in the Great Lakes, so that translates into smaller harvest. And you can see there's a lot of disparity there. This data is taken from the year 7 annual report for each of these forest management units. So a plan like Mazenod Lanark is averaging under 60,000 cubic meters of wood a year out of their year 7 annual report. And then you have Temiskaming up in the Northeast region, a boreal unit, which is averaging over 1 million cubic meters. So each of those forest management units has to write the same forest management plan. The planning requirements are the same for both. So there's a lot of disparity there. Obviously, some of your costs are going to scale with the size of your unit, but your planning costs don't. So anyway, just kind of interesting. The other one that's interesting, you look at French Severn, where they're averaging 40 or 4,000 hectares a year of harvest, and their average harvest volume is quite similar to Bancroft, Minden, and Ottawa Valley, which are harvesting less than half the area. And the reason for that is 50% or more of French Severn was selection harvest, where you're only taking 20 to 30% of the volume out of each stand. So kind of interesting seeing the disparity there. Manuals. So the Crown Forest Sustainability Act provides for 4 manuals to guide various aspects of forest management of Ontario. These are our guiding documents. The Forest Management Planning Manual is the first one, Forest Information Manual, Operation and Silviculture Manual, and the Scaling Manual. I deal with the first 3. I don't think I've even seen the Scaling Manual. It's more operational stuff that the district would deal with, not me so much in the region. The Forest Management Planning Manual outlines the process and content requirements of an FMP. The Forest Information Manual describes the information requirements for MNR and the exchange of forest-related information between MNR and Ontario's forest industry. The Forest Operations and Silviculture Manual sets out a list of approved guidance and direction that must be applied during the preparation and implementation of a FMP. And the manuals reference and enable a set of forest management guides. So we have a suite of 5 guides. These guides are a key part of Ontario's Sustainable Forest Management Framework. They provide evidence-based direction for forest managers and are used to support the long-term sustainability of our forest ecosystems and help address potentially adverse effects of forest management on ecological, social, or economic values in the forest. So we have 5 of these. There's the landscape guides. There's a boreal and a Great Lakes St. Lawrence landscape guide. This one is pretty much strictly strategic in scale, and it delves a little bit into kind of tactical planning. The stand and site guide is mostly tactical or operational. The silviculture guide deals with what are approved methods of harvesting or proper methods of harvesting different forest types. Cultural heritage guide is kind of direction on how to handle First Nations cultural sites on the landscape. And then the tourism guide, I don't think I've even seen that one, so I'm not going to speak to that. So the guides heavily influence how forest management planning is done and are specific to the forest regions they cover. So the landscape guide is our big one strategically, and I work in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, so we apply the Great Lakes St. Lawrence landscape guide. So this map is right out of the landscape guide, and it shows where each guide is applied. So the gray is where the Great Lakes St. Lawrence is applied, and then the white is where the boreal is applied. You can look at that, and anyone who's driven north out of Sault Ste. Marie will see that north of Sault Ste. Marie is in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence guide, and it's kind of difficult to say that that's actually Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest up there. The transition line is different than the forest management unit line, but the guide takes the current forest condition into account, and we still have to apply that guide on the northern part, but it's taken into account with all the different rules and stuff within it. The big difference between Great Lakes St. Lawrence North and South is one of the texture pattern indicators we assess is different between the two, as well as some of the different rule sets that go into the succession rules that they model for the landscape guide. So that's in very brief, the Ontario Forest Management Planning Framework. So I'm going to now get into how we develop a forest management plan. I'm going to talk about timelines, how we develop a planning inventory, how we classify our forest, and then how we develop a base model for strategic analysis. So here's the timeline on a forest management plan. It takes a long time to develop a forest management plan. This is kind of an ideal timeline for a 2021 forest management plan. It takes about 36 months at best to write a forest management plan. So if you want your plan approved by April 1st, 2021, you're probably going to start working on your planning inventory sometime back in the spring of 2018. It's a long time to prepare one of these things. At the top in yellow, these are our stages of public consultation when the public has a chance to review and comment on a forest management plan. And the blue is some checkpoints that we have built into the system where MNR will review the strategic planning done to date to make sure that everything is good. You don't want to get to the end of your operational planning and find out, oh, you did something wrong way back on your planning inventory that's critical and we have to redo. So we have these checkpoints built in. The first half of this is strategic planning. There will be a little bit of tactical planning involved in the first couple of years of planning, and then the back end is mostly tactical and operational with a few checks built in to assess the tactical planning, that the tactical planning is matching what we planned strategically. So this is an ideal timeline. Plans tend to do some parts. Each planning team tends to do one part quicker than other parts. We fall behind, we catch back up. We fall behind, we catch back up. It's a subject to change, I guess, for each plan. So I'm going to talk about the first three checkpoints now. So the planning inventory, forest classifications, and the base model. So your planning composite inventory, this is your forest resource inventory. The province of Ontario has a forest resource inventory for all of these forest management units. It's just a snapshot of time whenever we flew the inventory. And what the planning composite inventory is, the company that's managing the forest will take that forest resource inventory and update it with harvest activities, natural disturbances, renewal activity, and regeneration assessments. What this is essentially a starting point for your planning. There's no classifications built into the planning composite inventory. There's no classifications built into your planning composite inventory at this point. It's just a snapshot in time of what the forest looks like at checkpoint 1. So if I go back to this screen, it's your planning composite inventory for your 2021 forest management plan is a snapshot in time of what the forest looked like in August 2018, according to this timeline. So that's 2.5 years before the plan's implemented. So things will change on the forest between when your planning composite inventory was built and when the plan's implemented. And we take all that into account. So checkpoint 2, forest classifications. These are the classification schemes with which we will describe the forest for planning. So these are things like strategic management zones, forest units. So again, forest units are groupings of similar forests that will respond to silviculture treatment and are going to be harvested under the same silviculture system. There's age classes. We typically manage with a 10-year age class. Yield stratum, these are different within a forest unit, different groupings which have similar harvest volume on them. Strategic silviculture options, these are your clear cut, shelterwood, and selection. And then within each of those, whether you're going, there can be regeneration options. So clear cut with seeding, clear cut natural regeneration, clear cut planting, trying to convert to red pine, clear cut planting, trying to convert to something else. Those would be strategic silviculture options. They're quite coarse scale groupings of silviculture options. And then we also have wildlife and landscape guide classifications that we developed here in this part of the FMP. A lot of these are directed by MNR. So we say these are things you're going to manage for, and then others come from the planning team. The forest classifications provide context for identification of desired forests and benefits and management objectives. So the forest classifications plus a small amount of anticipated future depletions are then used to update the planning composite inventory and create a base model inventory. So this is a different inventory. It's your planning composite inventory classified with a small amount of anticipated future depletions to give a snapshot of what the forest will look like at the start of planning. So the planning composite inventory was April 2018. This is a snapshot of what the forest will look like in April 2021. And is classified with our classification schemes. So base model, now we know what the forest looks like. We've classified it. We need to be able to predict how it will change under different management scenarios. So the base model serves as a common starting point for the development of the long-term management direction. And you recall earlier, I had that quote, if you can define a problem mathematically, then you can solve it in an optimal manner. What the base model is a mathematical expression of the forest. And we have several things in there. We have first what the forest looks like. So we put our initial areas as defined by the approved forest classifications right into our model. So this is area by forest unit, age class, silvicultural intensity, and strategic management zone. So we also have options for treating that forest. We put our strategic silviculture options. So our intolerant clear cut, we can clear cut it and leave it for natural regen. We can clear cut and convert it to red pine. We can clear cut and convert it to something else. Those are strategic silviculture options. So we're giving the model options for treating each of those forest types. We also define how it will change through time. So naturally, the forest can change naturally. We can just leave it alone to do its own thing. So in some of our models, one of our models, we can put fire cycles in there. So we do have natural disturbance in the models. And we also have natural succession. So if you just leave the forest, it doesn't burn down, it just gets old and falls apart. What happens to it? And we also have options for how it changes under management. So that intolerant clear cut that you convert to red pine, what happens to it? Well, 80% of it turns into red pine, 20% turns into something else. You're defining all those rules for how the forest changes through time. And we also build into the model the ability to assess the management objectives. And at this stage, just to be very clear, at this stage, there's little to no management constraints in the model. You're not telling it what to do. You're just giving it the ability to model and then refine your management scenario. So we do have 4 approved models in Ontario. There's the old standby, the Strategic Forest Management Model, which we call SFM. It's been around for a very long time. All 4 of these models are different. They look at the forest in a completely different way. So SFM is just a strict linear program. It's aspatial. It doesn't look at individual stands. It's an aggregate model. We have Woodstock, which is made by a company called Remsoft on the East Coast. So this has been, and let me back up a little bit. So SFM is the only model that's been applied for an Ontario forest management plan in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. It's also been applied in the boreal. So Remsoft makes Woodstock, and they have been applied. They have done forest management plans in the boreal, and there is a project. I think the Department of National Defense for the federal government is writing a plan right now using Woodstock. It's a linear program, and it sends its aggregate model. It sends that solution to a spatial optimizer that then allocates the stand. So it's kind of a pseudo spatial model. We also have Patchworks, which is developed by Spatial Planning Systems. This has been applied by the Petawawa Research Forest. So again, a federal forest management plan. And in Ontario, it's been applied in the boreal forest in a few units. This is a goal programming formulation, which for someone who's into operations research like myself, I get really excited about that kind of thing. It's a truly spatial model. So you are actually managing each individual polygon in the model. And recently approved is the Forest Simulation Optimization System, FSOS. So this is goal programming and is truly spatial as well. So this one hasn't been applied to a forest management plan in Ontario yet, to my knowledge. So that's developing an FMP. 3 very quick slides for like 3 years worth of work. So that's kind of a very brief overview, but now we'll get into how we set management objectives. So we've got our planning inventory, we've classified it, and we've built our base model. How do we set management objectives? So I'm going to talk about 2 things, the desired forest and benefits meeting, and then one of our FMP tables, FMP 10. So desired forest and benefits meeting. MNRF hosts a meeting with planning teams and plan advisors, local citizens committees, First Nations and Métis communities, as well as other members of the public. This meeting provides input for the development of management objectives. We do several things at one of these meetings. We review current FMP objectives. So we look at our last plan. We say, what did we manage for there? What do we want to carry over? What objectives are no longer applicable. We might have had some policy change. We also look at annual reports. Is there anything in the enhanced annual reports that we identify that might have a trend that we want to have a management objective for? We look at independent forest audits. There's the Forest Management Planning Manual and the guides. The landscape guide has a number of objectives that make it into FMP 10. And we also have many locally desired forest. We have many locally desirable benefits that we want to manage for. So each individual forest is different, and objectives are, you have all kinds of local issues pop up that make it into FMP 10. So these objectives are documented in table FMP 10, and they include measurable criteria as well as timings for assessment. So this is what FMP 10 looks like, and I do want to say there should be a short-term projection on the right-hand side as well. So on the left-hand side of this, we have management objective, indicator, plan start level, desirable level, and timing of assessment. These are things that typically we fill in after the desired forest and benefits meeting. So we come up with our objectives. How do we want to measure that? That's the indicator. What do we have at the start, and what's our desirable level? That's stuff we can get out of our desired forest and benefits meeting. The actual targets, because not all those desirable levels are achievable, we want to have something that is achievable, so that's something that we refine through scoping analysis. So we have a target, and then we have a short 10-year, a medium 20-year, and long 100-year assessment of those targets. Not all management objectives are strategic in scale, so there's a lot of them that we measure with our wood supply model. A lot of other ones might be operational and are measured differently, and we wouldn't consider them till later in the plan, or even during plan implementation. So they all have timing of assessment in there when they're assessed. Some are at long-term management direction, some aren't. So the Sudbury 2020 Forest Management Plan, this is one that I was the analyst on, had 36 distinct objectives for their forest management plan. Many of these objectives had multiple individual indicators and targets. So for example, their wood supply target, which was their objective 21 out of 36, had multiple indicators. Their move towards natural variation, which was their 7th objective, had multiple indicators as well. These are measured in the short, medium, and long term. And Sudbury's FMP 10 was 9.5 pages long, and I'm going to show you that part of it on the next slide. And these are objectives for economic, environmental, and social. So we consider all 3 legs of the 3 pillars of sustainability. There's a couple of links there where you can find all of our approved FMP text and tables, annual reports, annual work schedules. The top link is probably going to be discontinued at some point before long, and then the bottom one will be where that's moving to. So it's currently on EFMP, the I don't even know what that stands for, Electronic Forest Management Planning website, and it's going to be moving to the Natural Resources Information Portal at the bottom at some point. So this is part of Sudbury's FMP 10. So this is 1 out of 9.5 pages. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know how big your screen is. I can barely see it on my big screen, but I just wanted to have that so you saw what it looked like. So this whole page is their wood supply objectives. So you can see right on the left-hand side, provide a sustainable, continuous, and predictable wood supply that will meet as closely as possible and for as long as possible the current recognized industrial demand of the Sudbury forest. Great objective. How do we measure it? Well, we have a number of indicators, and then we have even more individual indicators that we're assessing within those. So each of those, we have a desirable level, and this can differ from the target. Typically, after the desirable forest and benefits meeting, we fill up to the level of timing of assessment, and then the targets are refined through scoping. So that's one of their 36 objectives right there on that screen. Another one, number 7, is at the bottom of this, move towards a distribution of cereal stages that more closely resembles the expected natural variation. This one is right out of the landscape guide. So they're following the landscape guide direction with these indicators. This is one the Ministry of Natural Resources says you will have these as indicators. So that's what FMP 10 looks like. It's big and nasty, 9.5 pages long. Some of these will be assessed with the long-term management direction. Others are assessed differently at different parts of planning or even plan implementation. So that's setting management objectives. That's all fine and dandy, but how do we come to a balanced solution? We have all these different management objectives. We have wood supply, we have environmental objectives. What's balanced? So we're balancing the 3 pillars. How do we do that? I'm going to talk about scoping analysis, understanding constraints, and this is where the things get interesting, as well as the dependency of environmental objectives on economic forces. That's an interesting one. So forest management planning involves balancing multiple competing objectives. What is balanced? We have economic objectives, environmental objectives, and social objectives. We talked about desirable levels. We had those in FMP 10 earlier. Are they even possible? A lot of them aren't. There's quite a bit of them that aren't. Like we have a forest, which is a limited area. You're limited by the amount of area you have in your forest. You're limited by your starting condition of your forest. There's only so much you can do within 10, 20, or 100 years to change that forest into something else. I want 10 million cubic meters of wood a year. Good luck, you're not going to get it. It's not there. So I want 10 times as much white pine on my forest in 40 years. Can't get there. It's just not possible to do that. So some things are possible, some aren't. How do we move? How do we manage the forest? How do we move towards a desirable future forest? So scoping analysis, what scoping is, it's an iterative process that involves a series of investigations to provide insight into what the forest is capable of producing. We want to develop realistic and feasible targets for objective indicators. Each forest has its limits. You can't have everything that you want. Scoping informs on what the forest is capable of achieving for each objective or each set of objectives. Ultimately, there are trade-offs in managing for one objective to the other objective. So we're managing for environmental aspects. What's the impact if we concentrate on the environmental side of the forest to the industrial and social side, and vice versa? If we concentrate on wood supply, what's the impact environmentally and socially? And these are the way we do this trade-off analysis is by the management objectives defined in FMP 10. And it's kind of interesting, the trade-offs you do see. And on the right-hand side, there's no free lunch. Well, it's not entirely true. There's occasionally you find a free lunch in there where one objective complements another one, but it's not always the case. There's not always a free lunch would be more correct, but I didn't find that picture on the internet. So we tend to look at it as a bit of a tug of war. That's the first way you would look at it. And we try and think that we're pulling, each of our objectives is pulling as hard as it can to try and get that little circle into the right spot. And how do we balance it? The tug of war is not really the best analogy, I don't think. I've often used that, but it's not the best analogy. That's because that's not how our SFM objective function works per se. Like something like a goal programming formulation would be a tug of war, but SFM doesn't. So what we're actually doing with our forest is we're trying to maximize one objective. And that's the objective function. And with all of our other objectives, we're actually staking out areas of the forest within which that objective function can work. And those constraints can't be broken. So if I set my landscape guide target for white pine mix landscape class, I'm saying you have to have at least 60,000 hectares of that. You have to operate within that. So in this example, the orange there is every possible solution on your forest. It's every possible outcome for the objective function. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, you have to meet your landscape guide constraints. So you have to operate within that blue box. You have to stay in there. I'm not letting you go outside of it. And we say, okay, that's fine. We can do that. We also have to meet industrial demand. So that's limiting your solution. Again, you're saying you got to stay within the blue box and you got to stay within the brown box. We're also saying old growth is important. We want to make sure our old growth moves towards natural. So that's different than landscape class. We're saying you got to stay within the light blue box. Okay, fine. And then that objective function is able to do whatever it wants, but it has to stay within each of those boxes. So you're very much limiting the solution space of your forest through these management objectives. And that little box in the middle is really all that your forest can produce and still meet all of those objectives. So that's the way constraints work in a model like SFM. And it's kind of important to people say, why are we, there's so much concentration on the objective function in a model, but the objective function moves, the constraints don't. There is a danger when you overly constrain your model, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that not all desirable levels are achievable. So we can have situations where we set our landscape class constraint, say you got to stay within that blue, and you have to stay within the brown, and you got to stay within the light blue. So this is something where you can't meet all your objectives. You have to make some compromise on one or more of them in order to get a management solution. So some real examples from a forest I was involved with. Each of these is assessed at 10, 20, and 100 years. We have a landscape guide objective to increase the area of white pine mix landscape class on the management unit. Should be an obvious objective for everyone that's aware of forestry in Canada over the last 500 years. White pine was very much high graded by early settlers, and there's not nearly as much as there was. And that's what our natural projections show. There should be a lot more of it. So that is an objective, increase white pine mix on the landscape. We also have another objective, decrease the area of red oak shelter wood on the management unit. And this is actually quite complementary. So there's a free lunch, because the areas that the red oak shelter wood are growing on are easily converted to white pine mix. So these are areas that white pine can grow on as well. So we can convert the red oak to white pine mix. In this particular forest, that's a fairly easy transition. So win-win, we can meet those. There's also an objective to decrease the area of tolerant hardwood on the landscape. So this is easy as well. Red oak is a tolerant hardwood, so we can have all three of those, win-win-win. We have an objective to meet the industrial demand for white and red pine harvest volume on the management unit. Well, this one's in a little bit of conflict of the white pine mix landscape class. So that white pine mix landscape class is mature and old forest, and that's where most of our white and red pine harvest volume comes from. So that's in a little bit of a conflict there. And then where things really went out of whack was when we had an objective to maintain levels of, and this should say red oak food sources, red oak fall mast food sources on the management unit. So this was an objective that came out of the desired forest and benefits meeting, and it was due to the loss of beech on the landscape. They wanted to maintain oak, and it makes sense. And we had an objective for that. So, but this is where it really came into conflict. So what we had, if we go back to how our constraints work, we say, okay, you got to meet your hardwood landscape class, no problem. Got to meet your harvest volume, no problem. White pine mix, easy. Red oak shelterwood, no problem. And then we had our fall mast constraint, and it just didn't work. We could not have everything at once. So what do? We end up, we have to compromise. So we accepted a slower reduction of tolerant hardwood than we otherwise might have had. Didn't really change our white and red pine harvest volumes. It was just one that this didn't have a huge impact on the red oak. Our harvest volumes in white and red pine didn't have a big impact on our red oak mast levels. We also accepted a reduced long-term increase in white pine mix. We accepted a slower reduction of red oak shelterwood. And we changed this objective to minimize the reduction of fall mast on the landscape. So actually in this plan, the first 40 years, it slightly increases and then has a slow decrease. So it's not maintained long-term, but it's a far less reduction than what it could have been. So this individual constraint had a pretty big impact on the final solution for the model. So now we have a feasible solution. There's not a lot of room there that's a pretty tightly wound up model, and there's not a lot of room for it to move. So achieving a feasible management solution requires balance and compromise between all three of the objectives. And there's no free lunch. There's very few of them. You can't have one thing without a trade-off in another. The last thing I want to talk about is just the dependency of environmental objectives on economic forces. And this is an interesting one because the conflict between the two is obvious. You can't have mature forest and harvest lots of timber volume because the two are the same things. You can either harvest it or leave it standing there. So the conflict between the two is obvious, but I do want to talk about the dependency of environmental objectives on economic forces. So landscape guide direction is the desirable forest looks like one that has developed under natural processes. The landscape guide and associated science and information packages describe how this future forest potential is derived. We have simulated ranges of natural variation for all kinds of indicators. And the problem is that these natural processes don't really occur anymore in significant levels on the landscape. So we have fire suppression. Fire is a big driver on the forest, and we don't have that anymore. So what's the consequences? And how do we move towards natural without those natural processes anymore? So for this example, what I did, I took the Nipissing 2019 base model and I took the objective to increase white pine mixed wood, decrease tolerant hardwood. So those are the two objectives I'm looking at. It's a fairly common objective for all Great Lakes St. Lawrence plans. And I compared two scenarios on those two objectives. So I did a no harvest scenario. This is basically all it has in it is disturbance cycles that reflect fire suppression. It has natural succession, and I don't allow any harvesting activity at all. I also have a maximized landscape guide scenario. This has disturbance cycles that reflect fire suppression. It has natural succession, but I did allow harvest activity. And the other thing that I did was I added in management constraints where I tried to force the forest to meet its landscape guide objectives as quickly as it possibly could. And I compared the two, and this is what you see is that, so this is 4 different indicators, all ages of white and red pine, tolerant hardwood, and then 2 different white pine landscape classes. And what we find is that the maximized landscape guide scenario with harvesting actually approaches the natural condition quicker than the no harvest scenario. So the all aged red and white pine, you have a lot of stuff being converted to white and red pine there. The no harvest scenario greatly increases the amount of tolerant hardwood, and then the white pine mix is getting there quicker on the maximized landscape guide scenario than the no harvest scenario. And I just want to be clear with those 2 white pine indicators. I probably could have forced those higher, but I just didn't have time to force them as far as they could. But the bottom line, you can get more of it with harvest than without. So harvesting is an important tool for approaching a natural forest structure on the landscape. The other interesting thing is the amount of harvest. So this is Nipissing, and it was 5,000 hectares a year averaged for that maximized landscape guide scenario. So quite a bit of harvesting going on and approaching natural quicker than with no harvest. So kind of some conclusions there. In the absence of natural disturbance, harvesting can direct a forest towards natural quicker than without harvest. So we have conversions. There's also young forest. There's a certain amount of young forest on the landscape that is natural, and we get this through harvest. And then the big caveat there that levels of harvest are directly dependent on market conditions. So we can't harvest it if we can't sell it, and that has great implications. So a lot of those conversions might not be able to happen under market conditions. So market conditions don't always facilitate towards natural, moving the forest towards natural. So that's about all I have. So I'll turn it over to the moderators for questions if you want. I'll stop sharing.
That's great, Rob. Thank you. So as Rob mentioned, we'll open up the floor for some audience questions now. I've been keeping track of the chat, and it doesn't look like there's any questions in there yet, but we had one come through email. I'm not sure if Keith is in here. He's the one that emailed the question in, but I'll just read it out for you, Rob. He asked, on Crown lands in some areas of Ontario, harvesting and management is done by private companies that usually consist of a consortium of private companies. One such company, for example, is the Bancroft Minden Forest Company. These companies, as I understand, are responsible for the whole range of management, including regeneration. And he asks then, describe the fit or the role of the MNRF in this method of forest management. And do you see this model as a norm to which the MNRF is moving?
So that's that kind of scenario. Bancroft-Minden's one of our southern region plans, and we have probably 4 of our 5 would fit that kind of an SFL structure, that they're conglomerates of small stakeholders. I wouldn't think that's the common trend, because we have everything from that sort of situation in the southern region to big companies that have multiple management units up in the boreal, as well as First Nations communities that have our SFL holders, right? So if you want to know the trend, I would say is, if you look at the more recent SFLs, like Bancroft-Minden's been around a while, so the more recent ones are that I can think of anyway. I'm not a licensing specialist, but the most recent ones that I'm aware of are First Nations communities. So that would be the most recent trend. What MNR's role, it's about the same. Like the process is the same, whether you're a great big multinational company, or if you're a small stakeholder, or if you're a smaller conglomerate like Bancroft-Minden. MNR, we basically regulate it. So we regulate, we do participate in plant production, but we regulate the harvest. It's run by the SFLs, and we're a regulator ultimately. So hope that answers that.
Cool. Nobody else has said anything in the chat again yet, so I'll just lead into this next question. To what extent is climate change now being factored into forest management plans? For example, we may see or already are seeing changes in summer and winter temperatures, precipitation, etc. These must have an impact on the impact of forest harvesting or even on regeneration. So how is climate change factoring into MNRF management plans?
So we have, of the plans I'm aware of, I can think of 4 that have objectives for like specific in FMP 10 around climate change. Nipissing and Sudbury had objectives around carbon sequestration. Like, so there's some federal models that were run to determine how much the management scenario was, how much carbon the management scenario was sequestering compared to a more natural run. So there's that option. I think Algonquin Park is doing the same thing. And then I believe Ottawa Valley has something more around planting, something more operational around planting trees that might be better adapted in the future. I think it's a tough one. Assisted migration's a nasty tough one, because you plant something that's will grow here 70 years from now, it still has to survive the cold winters now, right? So it's it's an ugly one. So those are what I'm aware of currently. My very strong suspicion is there will be a lot of objectives around climate change. There will be required objectives in the next manual, would be my very strong suspicion. I don't know that for sure, but that's my guess.
Cool. Before I go to the next question, I just want to let everybody know we're just going to go a few minutes over here because we do have a few questions. So next up is Fraser Smith, who I thought might have a question. You want to go ahead, Fraser?
Thanks, Reiner. Rob, great presentation. Thanks so much. I just wanted to, I was hoping that you could explain a little bit, or go into a little bit more detail on, I mean, I really like that quote of, you know, if you can define a problem mathematically, that you can find an optimal solution, and optimal purely within like the engineering framework definition of the word optimal. But I think everybody recognizes that there are also conditions and constraints within the forest management planning process, such as public demands, local citizens committee, things like this, that are far more subjective and difficult to define mathematically.
Yeah.
So what's a bit of the process that you go through in terms of framing those let's just call them demands or requests within a mathematical framework so that they can be optimized?
Well, so the only we really only require optimization at the strategic level, right? Like I don't think, well, that's not entirely true. There is tactical stuff there's some tactical stuff as well. But I guess the first step is determining whether it's a strategic, tactical, or operational question you have. And that's, so that slide where I showed the 3 levels of planning, like if I had one thing I wish everybody that I dealt with understood, it's that, right? That there's strategic, operational, and tactical levels of planning and modeling. Like the forest looks very different strategically than it does operationally, right? So that's the first step, is defining what the actual question is, right? And that's easier said than done. It requires a lot of conversations. That red oak fall mast question, that was a lot of work to come up with that one objective, right? And I think that was a First Nations community that came forward with that one, and it was a very valid. I had a hard time arguing with their logic on it. It was a very good objective, and it was a lot of conversations to find out what the problem is, as well as, and then figure out a proper way when it should be measured for one, and then the proper way to measure it. Because we've had all kinds of stuff come up in those desired forest and benefits meeting. I think it came up in one of them that they wanted some of the pine. There's a comment, they wanted some of the pine from the one forest to go to rebuilding Notre Dame Cathedral. And that came up in one of our desired forest and benefits meeting. And I don't know whatever happened to that, but that doesn't go into our strategic model. That's something else, right? So
little fine filter.
Yeah. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. Appreciate it.
Good.
Cool. Thanks, Fraser. Okay. So next up, we have a question in the chat from Howard. He asks, does the designation of the forest management plan for private landowners prohibit future development of the land with a cottage or hunting cabin or future severances?
Sorry, can you read that again?
Does the designation of the FMP for private landowners prohibit future development of the land? So using it for different things like a cottage or a hunting cabin, or future severances of the land?
I'm not at all aware of, I don't know. Sorry, that isn't my area of specialty. I'm not sure how that would work.
Maybe Howard, if you want to clarify a little bit in the chat, I can get to that again afterwards. So I had another question from Keith that came in through the email as well. And he says, do you personally have concerns over the provincial government plans to expand the amount of harvesting being done in Ontario? And can you explain?
So to clarify what that direction is, and that's not new direction, that's something that the Ontario government in whatever form has been trying to do for decades. You recall the slide on strategic, tactical, and operational. A good planning process implements the strategic plan very closely tactically and very closely operational. What we have in Ontario is we average about 50% utilization. So what we model that we harvest 1,000 hectares, and we actually only on average harvest about 500. So it's, and utilization's different from management unit to management unit. Temiskaming, the one that I showed earlier, I think it's up over 70% utilization. French Nipissing and Sudbury are slightly better than 50, and some of our other southern region ones are well below 50. So what the Ontario government's talking about doing is actually matching that actual harvest to what we're modeling. And I strongly support it because it allows for more of those conversions to converting more forest towards natural, where the stuff we can sell, we're already harvesting at probably the proper levels. And what we need to do is come up with more markets for some of that underutilized stuff. So things like red maple, and I know a forester out in Pembroke, and she would be happier than stink if you could buy all of her red maple. She'd be so happy. And it's just something we can't sell it, and we have more of it than is natural. And that's what the Ontario government's looking at doing, is closer matching that what we're implementing to what we're modeling, and I strongly support it just from a planning and operations research side. I think it would be a great move.
Cool. Okay. So I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I figure I'll just end off with this one last question. What do you see as the biggest misconceptions about the idea of sustainable forest management? So you mentioned the 3 pillars of sustainability a number of times throughout your presentation. Yeah, what do you think are people's biggest misconceptions about?
That harvesting is bad. We've seen like bad examples of harvesting are obvious. Like we've all seen those, but like I've done a lot of modeling, and you can't approach a natural forest condition without harvesting. It's a philosophical point too. Like it's if you ever see me somewhere and want to have a crazy conversation, we'll talk about what is natural. It's a really deep philosophical question. And what is natural? What's the role of humankind within the environment? It's bad examples of harvesting are obvious. We've all seen them. I'm yet to meet a forester that I think takes joy in destroying the environment. I'm yet to meet one. I think they all love trees. They all love the environment. They love the animals that are in the forest. And that I think is my biggest one, that harvesting's bad.
Cool. Sorry, actually, I got another question here in the chat. So Ontario is looking to, this is from Alex. Thank you, Alex. Ontario is looking to grow its timber industry, especially with new mass timber technologies being used in architecture and other design fields. How do you envision this industry demand growing in relation to the current management of forests? And where will this wood likely come from within Ontario?
Depends what the where it comes from would depend on what the products are, and it's there's all kinds of underutilized wood out there that we need to be harvesting, and like red maple is a perfect example. There's all kinds of it in Eastern Fraser. What do you think of red maple? There's all kinds of it out there, and there's all kinds of underutilized wood. It's whether that is sufficient, whether it has the proper quality to be used for those kind of engineered products is the other question. It's easy to say we have all this underutilized volume. It's more difficult to say. It's more difficult to find a use for it.
If you could find me a market, I'd love that. Thank you.
You're another one. There's 2. I know. There's 2. Yeah. So.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. So if there are no other questions, we can wrap it up here. Just want to say thank you, Rob, Keron, for joining us for Forest Management Planning Data and Analysis Challenges in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forests of Ontario. To see or register for any of the Daniels events this year, just head to the news and events page on the Daniels faculty website. The next event we have lined up in the Daniels lecture series is Design Through an Indigenous Lens, Decolonizing Our Approach to Architecture with Matt Hickey. And it's coming up on Tuesday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We hope to see you online again soon. Thank you again, Rob, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.